As I was preparing for you this evening, I came across an amusing story that I thought I'd begin to share with you. It was about a woman who was trying to get ready for Christmas like most of us had been, and she was sort of rushing around. And for this particular woman, it was really important for her to send out Christmas cards. I don't know if you're one of those people or not, but it was a thing for her and her family, and she felt like she really needed to do it, sort of known for it. And it was a couple of days before Christmas, and she hadn't got that part done, and she was feeling really self-conscious about it. And so without any more delay, she immediately started going through. She made a list. She goes, no, I have to narrow my list down. I'm only going to send this to the people who are in town, because by the time I get to the post office, it's not going to be able to go to everyone. So she made her list. She got it all exactly right. She counted the number that she was needed, and then she was off to the store. And she was just like, running down the aisle. The card was sort of depleted, and she was looking through, hoping there would be some cards left. She came across this package that was just the right ones. It had this manger on it and a star. It had enough cards. In fact, it was even a few more cards than she needed, so she just grabbed it, ran to the home, and then she started filling them all out. She put the stamps on them. She got them all signed. She got back to the post office, sent them out, and then, that sort of smug smile you get whenever you've done something and you know it's well and you're self-satisfied. And then she went back and she was sort of cleaning up the mess afterwards of all of her frantic trying to get them all done together. And she just, sort of paused for a moment and looked at the card. And she was just sort of, what a peaceful little moment. But she hadn't actually read through the very end of the message. And so she looked at it as peaceful, and she was going through until she got to the final line that said, this simple note is just to say that a little package is on the way. Now, those words were not exactly her sentiments and what she was sending. She just wanted to send a Merry Christmas greetings. But they do parallel the message that's been given to the shepherds that we just heard about. For on that holy night not long ago, the angel proclaimed the news that a little package was not just on the way, but a little package had been delivered. That announcement that we just heard, I want to repeat. For the announcing angel said, "Do not be afraid. I bring you good news of great joy that will be for all the people. Today in the town of David, a Savior has been born for you. He is Christ the Lord. This will be a sign for you. You will find a baby wrapped in cloths and lying in a manger." Other angels quickly joined this lone messenger, and the Judean sky was set ablaze of this heavenly choir proclaiming, "Glory to God in the highest, and on earth peace to men." And sometimes we miss that last phrase, "with whom his favors rest, or with whom he is well pleased." What they proclaimed was recorded by Luke, and we've been relishing that story again this evening. But every time I hear the Christmas story, my eyes are a little bit wide with wonder at the awe of all these events coming about at exactly the right time. We of a church have been going through the prophecies that have been given in advance, all of the preparations that God made for 700, 500, we get all of these years. God is taking care of every little detail, so everything is exactly just right, so that all of these advanced things are being done to get the right people into the right place at exactly the right time. Yet I'm always a little puzzled at one thing that was not taken care of by God in advance. One thing that all of us know by heart, one thing that comes up whenever we go through the Christmas story, the fact that there was no room for them at the end. I mean, for God who put everything together, why did he leave this little detail off? I mean, those two words, no room, seem to be prophetic of Jesus' life. For during it, not many people really found room for him. I mean, sure, there were crowds of people that followed around him, but they seemed to be after something. They wanted to be miraculously fed, or they wanted to be miraculously healed, or they knew someone who needed some touch from Jesus. They were there to get something from him, but they didn't really have room for Jesus in their life. And so once they got what they felt they needed, the crowd seemed to melt away. they really didn't have room for him. They were like the various soils that Jesus would later talk about, that the good seed of his word would fall. There was no room on the hard road, no room in the rocky soil, no room in the thorns and the thistles. But thankfully there was room in that good soil, right? There was that little bit of good soil that the word would come into, and it would produce and it would multiply. And most of us think of ourselves as that good soil, don't we? As those who have made room for Jesus. Yet it still makes me wonder if God could place a star in the sky to lead wise men on this chase to find baby Jesus in this exact location. Why couldn't he make reservations for both Joseph and Mary in the inn in advance? I mean, it only takes a phone call, right? I mean, God could have done that. I know what you're thinking. For all of us have been told time and again that Mary and Joseph's arrival in Bethlehem, when they got there, every hotel was filled to capacity because everybody was returning to their hometown, just as Mary and Joseph were. It was a crowded place. And the reason there was no room was, we're told, at least by Hallmark, that they came in at a late arrival. And the reason they were late because, well, I mean, Mary just wasn't in any condition for traveling. She was ready to give birth. They had to travel slower than everyone else. And by the time they got there, everything was taken up. And they get to the inn, and the poor innkeeper has to give them the bad news, right? But at least he lets them stay in the stable around the back. That's sort of the traditional way we hear it. However, there are a few difficulties with this explanation of Luke in his depiction of the Christmas story that I want to explore just a little bit with you this evening. For starter, the holy couple's late arrival on Christmas Eve stands in exact opposition to what Luke wrote in verse 6. He said, while they were there, the time came for the baby to be born. The way it's phrased in Greek, it implies that they had been in Bethlehem. They were there for a while. Maybe not a long time, maybe only a day or two, maybe even only an afternoon, but it wasn't a late arrival. They had plenty of time to find a place to stay. It's important to remember that Bethlehem also was Joseph's ancestral home. That is, where he came from. He was not traveling to some strange city where he wouldn't know anyone. Bethlehem is where his family lived, his ancestors lived. He may not have always wanted to be close to them, but he would have known people there. Just like all of those other people who were traveling to Bethlehem, they were relatives of his, even if they were just distant ones. Joseph would have known some of those people, surely. I mean, you would think if he was going to an ancestral home, there might have been someone he could have called on, some old friend or some distant relative that knew who he was. I mean, someone he could say, hey, can we stay on the fold-out couch? I mean, you know how that is. I mean, people who can't afford a hotel, we tend to do that, even today. I mean, we'll look up friends that we haven't talked to in a long time, or relatives that were really distant relatives, and we're like, you know, we're coming through the city, and we're kind of wondering if you might get a place that we could sort of sleep for the night. I mean, it kind of makes me wonder why Joseph, going to his ancestral home, surrounded by people who are family, I mean, why would he approach a commercial inn rather than turning to family and friends? Surely there would have been a place somewhere for him that night that God could have arranged. Really, a better question to ask is, why do we assume that it was in a commercial inn? There's no mention of an innkeeper who refuses them lodging. The Bible simply says there's no place for them in the inn. We have created the innkeeper from our own imaginations. In fact, the word translated inn appears in only one other place in the Bible. It's in the account of when Jesus sent his disciples ahead of him to find a place so they could celebrate the Passover. On that occasion, as you may recall, Jesus sent a couple of disciples on ahead of everyone else so they could get things ready for them. And he gave them some sort of interesting instructions. Jesus told them, he says, hey, when you come into the city, you're going to see a man, and he's got a jar of water on his head, and I want you to follow him, and he's going to get you to a house. And when you get to the house, I want you to tell the owner of the house, where is the inn where I may eat the Passover with my disciples? Well, it doesn't get translated in there. It gets translated guest room, because that's what that word really means, even in this passage in Luke. It means guest room. You see, with all of the people that come in from out of town, a lot of these people would have their guest room, their main room, and they would rent it out for people who were traveling in for special festivals like Jesus was taking his disciples to. And it was this sort of guest room that Mary and Joseph found no room in. I mean, think about, even now, we have a lot of people that come over. Most of us are making arrangements, trying to make sure they have a bed or a place. But if you've just got a small place and you just have a big room, at least back then, you would just put everyone in down on that big room. And you would just let them sleep there. And it was so full of family and friends, there just wasn't any room for them. There is a Greek word for a commercial inn, something other than a guest room. But it only appears at the end of the parable of the Good Samaritan. In that account, not only is the innkeeper mentioned, but he's given charge to take care of the man who was set upon by thieves. He's paid a little extra to make sure he mends well. In other words, our English translators have sort of done us a disservice in Luke's account of the Christmas story in any translation you read. It really should be, there was no place for them in the guest room. That guest room would most likely have been in the home of Joseph's family. No room with the family. This is a more historical understanding, and it may go against your hallmark perceptions of what happened on Christmas Eve. But I want to push this point just a little bit further with you. There is an archaeologist. His name is Dr. Kenneth Baylor. And he does some specialty in which he decided that he would look through the ruins of houses in ancient Bethlehem. And so his whole career has been on unearthing homes in Bethlehem, because he was drawn to this whole talk about Jesus being born in a house, and of course he will hopefully find the right house. And he found some interesting things as he unearthed house after house in ancient Bethlehem where Jesus would have been born at. He discovered that they were all homes like we might think of. They all had this large room in them that would be referred to as the family room, the guest room. Whenever someone would come in, you would use it for that purpose. And right adjacent to this room, they would have sort of a covered porch that goes to the outside. And in the rest of that area, it would have a walled courtyard area. And so whenever people would come over and they would have guests, you would put the animals in that sort of courtyard area, and they could go underneath that little outside porch. And what he discovered is in the walls of that porch, they would have carved out stone feeding troughs. A manger. That's what a manger means. Granted, they were in the walls or in the floor, and they were made out of stone, and instead of the way we tend to envision them. He did find a couple of very large homes that had a place further away for the animals, where they would take a cave and build out from it to use as a stable, but it was only for the very wealthy. It was probably this sort of a home that the wise men from the east, when they traveled to Bethlehem, found Mary and her baby. If you remember from Matthew chapter 2, verse 11, it says that they were in a house, not an inn, not a barn. House. And it was the kind of houses those people really lived in. It could be by the time that they arrived, there may have been some room for Mary to be in a better location in the house for them to worship him. Even so, with all of that great new knowledge, my original question to you is left unanswered. Why was there no place prepared in advance for Jesus' birth? Why was there no room? Some have suggested that it was God's plan for there to be no room. That he planned all along in advance for there to be no room in a home that was crowded with family and friends who'd gone together at almost like a family reunion. Remember, Jesus would once say, "Who are my brothers and sisters and mothers but those who do the will of God?" You might recall the time when there was a scribe that came to Jesus and he wanted to be Jesus' disciple. I mean, he was someone who was reading the Word, and he goes like, "Man, there's this Jesus guy. I want to follow him." And Jesus just looked at him and said, "Foxes have holes, birds have nests, but the Son of Man, I don't even have a place to lay my head. No place to call home." There's always this aspect of not having room for Jesus. One of the other disciples at that time was trying to want to follow Jesus, and he said, "Hey, Jesus, I want to follow you, but I need to go back and bury my father." He told these would-be disciples that had other important things in their lives, and those things seemed important, that they really didn't have any room in their lives for him. He actually phrased it this way, and sometimes it seems harsh. He told these would-be disciples, "No one, after putting their hand to the plow and looking back, is fit for the kingdom of God." Do you really have room in your life for Jesus? Or do you just want the things that he can provide you? There was a teacher of homiletics that I enjoyed a lot. His name was Thomas Long, and he told us some stories of a time whenever he had been in the ministry before he became a teacher of preachers. And he was talking about a time whenever he was at this little small congregation and they were having one of those traditional Christmas pageants. You've probably been involved in one or helped produce one. If you've been in a small congregation, I mean, it takes everybody to take part in it. And you expect things to happen and to be almost humored by the things that were going on. And one of the boys that was one of the volunteers was this kid in their church named Wally. I mean, he was sort of your typical junior high kid. He was a little awkward. He was already a little tall for his age. He was pretty lanky. He was self-conscious about how other people saw him because he was sort of taller than everyone else that was around him. He was one of those kids where, his clothes were ever sort of straining against the limits of who he was. He was well accepted. Generally overlooked, though. Often excluded because he never had that need to speak up for himself. In fact, it was only with sort of mild enthusiasm that Wally was selected. That we need an innkeeper. And they figured that Wally could do this, even though he didn't like being in front of people, because he only had to say those 2 words. No room. Pressure was on. Christmas Eve came. They had their pageant, and everyone was ready. Like you, when you come in, you're not looking for perfection. You're looking for some time with your family and your friends to worship together and maybe be entertained with some unintended moments of lighthearted humor, especially when children are involved. They thoroughly enjoyed seeing the second grader who methodically provided the special music by pounding her way through old little town of Bethlehem. It wasn't a masterpiece, but they were delighted to see a little girl take part in their services, and they applauded as if they'd been at an opera. And when she struck her final chord, the lights were dimmed, and that befuddled group of shepherds in their oversized terry-cloth robes and their worn-out sneakers made their way with their makeshift staffs, and they were followed by a confused flock of noisy kindergartners who were sheepishly attired with polished noses and cotton balls on their ears. Moments later, in sort of a fluttered, feisty band of 4th grade angels came in to be the heavenly host. Everything was going well. After they adjusted the coat hanger halos and collectively beginning to search in vain for the right key of "Oh Come All Ye Faithful." They finally got the pageant back going again. It got to that point that Wally was going to get to use those famous words, and Joseph and Mary hobbled their way across the stage. They knocked on the door. He opened it up. Wally sort of grumbled to his feet. He did his best to look like the stern innkeeper. He used his well-rehearsed line to the holy couple standing before him, "No room." "But sir," Joseph pleaded, "my wife is having a baby." It was an improvised line, not one they had practiced. Wally wasn't really sure what to do. He only had one line, so he figured he would try it again. And so he said, no room. Well, this time, Mary improvised. She said, but please, kind sir, please, won't you reconsider for us? We're about to have a child. Wally didn't know what to say. I mean, what do you say? It just didn't seem right to say no room. But he shrugged his shoulders. He shook his head. He couldn't get the words out. Joseph and Mary, in good form, turned and they headed back across the stage. Wally is caught up in the moment, like he'd been living there, as if he was part of it, as if it was more than a play. And just before the holy couple step off the stage, he startles everyone. He says, wait, don't go. You can have my room. Now, admittedly, that's not a part of the Christmas story. Nothing historical about it. But it is a part of the way that we live our lives. We tend to commit and content ourselves with a Hallmark version. Let's just get the play enacted and the story told and the songs sung. Let's make sure we get our traditions done and everything looks good. And we keep ourselves so busy that I'm afraid there is no room for Jesus. As we come to our time of communion, this is time for us to say, wait a second, Lord. There is room. You can have my room. You can come into my heart. There's a place for you to dwell. You can change my life. We're going to be